Nobody in my traditional Southern family knew my sister was expecting until we received a phone call from an emergency room doctor interrupting spaghetti night. My mother took the phone call and she was listening intently, and then her face had an expression I had never seen before. Was it sadness? No. Was it anger? No. I really had no idea. My mother was having a very hard time dealing in that moment, realizing she had now had a daughter that had just given birth to a baby, and she had been living in our house for the last 6 months, and none of us knew. This pretty much shook my parents to the core. Now, my parents' parenting style might be described as semi-loving dictator. And my older sister was their best subject. She followed all the rules. Well, except one. She didn't follow that one, but she followed most of the rules. And so their parenting style went from being a dictator to all of a sudden they were doing everything by committee. Now, committee meant they asked the neighbors, they asked their friends, they asked the hospital chaplain at the hospital my sister was at that they had never met before, and he was Jewish, what they should do about my sister's situation. They even began to ask me, and I was totally surprised by that. We were never asked our opinion in the house. And I was a little emboldened by having my opinion asked for all the time over the last few days, and it felt good. And so while we were in the waiting room that day, we were sitting there, and I just used my newfound power to blurt out and say, my sister should not marry that boy. My parents sat motionless, barely breathing. I knew I had crossed a line, but I wasn't sure what it was. But I really believed that truth was the currency that adults traded in. So I continued. And I said, also, we need to talk about this baby. I think she should put it up for adoption. I was 13 years old at the time, and definitely somebody you want to take life advice from. And I gave this whole justification. My sister is only 19 years old. She had a full scholarship to the university. She was by far the brightest of all of us. My parents sat there and listened, but I could feel the last week, all the angst in the house was definitely pointing toward my sister, but I could feel it begin to shift and turn toward me. And this is where I did something stupid. Again, I thought truth was the right way to go. And so as we sat there, I said, and by the way, I need to tell you something, Mom and Dad. I'm a Democrat. Now, this may seem funny to you, but I was 13 years old in Alabama. And I then said, you know those New Yorker magazines that you found in my room? It's not just for the cartoons. I read the articles. And I thought this was a secret I was going to take to my grave. That same face my mother had had on spaghetti night returned. My father had his own face, this now crestfallen that it was, but his had a definite tinge of anger. We sat silently for what I thought was an eternity. I did not know what got me kicked off the committee that had been formed to make the life decisions for my sister, but one of those 3 decisions got me kicked off. The next week became a blur. Decisions were being made, plans were being laid, conversations were being had, but I had no idea what was going on. On Thursday, there was a dress laid out on my bed. Next to it were my most uncomfortable church shoes, and there was a note that said, "Come home from school. Be dressed by 4:30. Make sure your little sister is clean." Are we going out to visit relatives in this situation? What was going on? I had no idea. About that time, the doorbell rang, and there were 2 people at the door. Our pastor and a man and wife I had never seen before, but they all 3 had the spaghetti face on. And immediately I thought, someone has died. Who has died? Right after that, the doorbell rang again, and there was a boy that was standing there. It looked like the boy that my sister had dated for the last year, except the boy standing there looked about 1,000 years older. And he had his own indecipherable expression on his face. And I thought, all of a sudden, this young man has no idea my parents have formed a committee that have made all the decisions in his life over the last week. And in that moment, I felt sorry for him. And the person my parents had made to be the villain in the story became the sympathetic character. It wasn't until that exact moment that I realized what was about to happen in our house. A wedding was going to happen in our living room that day. And I panicked and I ran to my sister's room. I got to the door and I said, "You do not have to do this. There is not one happy person up in that room, and we can figure a way out of this." Again, I don't know why she didn't trust a 13-year-old to make her life plan, but she looked at me in this face of horror. I heard my father's footsteps before I heard his voice. But then that deep baritone down the hallway came out, and he said, "Julia, your sister has made a mistake that we will all pay for. You have shown us this week that you do not have the moral character that we expect in this family, and you are no longer like us." And just like that, I became an outsider in my own family. I was the sympathetic character that now got turned into the villain. That night, all the guests left. I went to the pantry, I pulled out noodles, I pulled out sauce, and I made spaghetti for myself for the first time in my life. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I openly read the New Yorker magazine. And I sat there and I thought, you know, they're right. A baby really changes everything.